In our society, there's an incredible amount of economic activity that's happening all the time. We can monitor that activity in a number of ways. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is a monetary measure of the value of output in the entire economy. The unemployment rate is a more personal indicator of how difficult it might be for workers to find jobs. Inflation and interest rates are other quantitative economic variables that have importance to investors when making decisions about buying a home or acquiring capital. Now, if we want to understand how these quantitative variables move through time, we can begin by analyzing the fundamental or core economic system. But to have a chance at learning about something so complicated, we want to simplify what we look for and streamline our inquiry as best we can. In this class, we'll simplify basic economics and try to derive ways to answer three important questions. In an economy, we want to know 1, what will be produced, 2, how it will be produced, and 3, who will get what is produced. Think about the first question, what will be produced? Production is the output from the system, but it's more than physical creation and involves any sort of transformation of a good or service. Products include cars and boats, clothing, food, consumer durables, movies, rock concerts, accounting and legal services, transportation, storage, healthcare, and on and on. Now, the vast mix of output, or what will be produced, has to be produced somehow. Will it be made by synthetic or natural resources, made by hand or by machine, with union or non-union labor, distributed by truck or train, made in the United States or abroad? These questions relate to how things are produced. The final question is who will get what is produced. It's no surprise that earnings largely determine purchasing power or the command over output. CEOs of large companies, for example, make about 200 times more income per year than the average worker. Blacks earn, on average, about 40% of what white workers earn. Males earn about 28% more money than females. Our premise is that economic systems evolve to answer these questions. These systems determine the mix of output, what will be produced, the allocation of resources devoted to production, how it will be produced, and the distribution of output, or who will get what. Our goal is to understand how systems function or dysfunction. Our clear focus for this class is on market systems in capitalist economies. The perspective we'll take is to observe, model, and explain as best we can. That's called positive economics. All societies are endowed with resources. These can be human resources or natural resources such as fertile land, minerals, or water. Resources also can be provided by previous generations through accumulated savings, which is called capital. Knowledge is another important resource that is embodied in technology. Land, labor, capital, and technology are the primary factors of production and are limited to a greater or lesser degree across societies and through time. Given the set of resources or inputs to production, societies must make decisions about how to transform inputs into outputs or product. Outputs are used to satisfy wants and desires. These wants and desires may be unlimited. So, for example, no matter how much stuff we have, we may want more. There are several ways these decisions can be made. In the recent past, central planning was tried. In command or planned economies, central authorities or government agencies determine the mixture and timing of production. Distribution schedules determine who will get what is produced. You probably know that central planning has not worked so well in practice. Soviet economists imagined they could use sophisticated computer models to simulate decentralized market behavior. That idea, however, far exceeded capacities of computing hardware and software. Some economists believe, though, that such an idea isn't outrageous. A polar opposite to a planned economy is a laissez-faire economy. In this type of economic system, individuals are allowed to pursue their own self-interest without any regulation or direction. In 1776, Adam Smith published a very influential text, The Wealth of Nations, that presented arguments for a laissez-faire economic system. Smith believed that government intervention and control impeded economic progress and growth. Smith saw that private, self-interest motivated producers to supply goods and services that consumers wanted to buy. He imagined an invisible hand that promoted a benefit to society which was not intended.
Historical Moments with John Watkins, Ph.D.
If people are motivated by self-interest, what prevents Peter from robbing Paul? So long as Peter can get away with it, why not take that economics text, grab the six-pack, or smash a store window and take the VCR? Why not make millions of dollars by merging companies that eliminate the jobs of thousands? Or make millions of dollars by gambling with taxpayers' money? Or overcharge the government for services rendered? Or worse yet, why not shoot those whom we dislike? If each of us is out for his or her own interests, regardless of the interest of others, what keeps society from dissolving into anarchy? Some years before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote a book entitled The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The book raises the following question: what is the basis of human relations? Smith's answer: sympathy, or what we today call empathy, our ability to place ourselves in another's shoes. We do not harm others because we empathize with them. We have the capacity to imagine ourselves in their shoes. Empathy creates a social bond of sorts, a sense of compassion. The principle of sympathy serves as a means of social control, allowing the principle of self-interest to do its work. The two principles, what's best for me versus what's best for others, appear contradictory. If so, it's a contradiction rooted in history. The market economy evolved associated with institutions that stifled the worst forms of self-interest and helped channel self-interest into socially acceptable ways. Aside from the law, those institutions include religion, family, and so on. At a time in which violence seems to be increasing, what has happened to those supporting institutions that keep self-interest in check? Some contend it reflects the moral decay of our society. Others contend that the demise of religion, family, and so on results from the market itself. In other words, the market destroys the very institutions that enable it to work. Religion becomes a business enterprise. Child raising becomes commodified. And morality comes to be defined by the mass media, whose purpose is not spiritual enrichment, but personal gain.
In a laissez-faire economy, a market is the central institution which answers the questions of what will be produced, how production will proceed, and how products will be distributed. A market is a mechanism that allows buyers and sellers to interact via exchange. Market interactions can be simple.
Okay, you want to pay $52 for 4,300 General Mills? That's for WD, right? I got you, baby.
Or complex. In the 18th century, markets were physical locations where trade took place. Auctions are typically markets that are confined to very small time and space. Through time, markets became more abstract. The stock market is an example of a market that is immense, where buyers and sellers never meet and exchange is represented by a blip on a computer screen. Electronic markets are now common. Virtual reality shopping is now available over the internet. With just a few keystrokes, you can visit thousands of stores and shop for almost anything you can imagine. Ultimately, the exchanges of funds are transferred via a chain of financial transactions that are increasingly electronic. Now, there are both output or product markets and input or resource markets. That gives rise to a circular flow in a market economy. Here's how it works. Firms buy resources such as labor in the input market to produce for sale in the output market. Households buy products in the output market and sell resources in the input market. There is an accompanying flow of finances. Firms supply households with incomes, and households supply firms with revenues. In a free market, goods and services are produced only if the supplier expects to make a profit. The desire for profit is a crucial assumption in our model. Making a profit means selling something for more than it costs to produce it. Sellers can't make profits unless there are buyers willing to pay. The fact that producers pay attention to the wants and desires of buyers leads to the concept of consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty is the idea that consumers ultimately decide what will be produced by choosing what to purchase. A question, of course, is the extent to which consumer sovereignty actually exists, and how much consumers' desires are influenced by advertising or by the desires of producers. John Kenneth Galbraith is among the most vocal economists in rejecting the model that consumers decide what to buy. Galbraith wrote that the initiative in decision-making doesn't come from the sovereign consumer, but from the producer who bends the productive mechanism to suit his will.
There it is, this new DeSoto that challenges the industry on the score of economy, beauty, safety, and performance.
Given that consumers desire a product for whatever reason, producers must decide how to organize and coordinate the actual production and delivery. In order to realize a profit, producers seek ways to efficiently produce. In a free market, consumers decide what to produce and firms decide how to produce. Well, let's see how the profit motive drives production. If production is costly and there exists a cheaper or more efficient way to make a comparable product, competitors will appear and take business away. Competition forces producers to use the methods of production that use the minimal amount of resource inputs. Within a context of a free market, competition forces the decisions about how production should proceed.
And now it's time for Chalk Talk with your host, Miss Sarah.
A firm, when it's deciding how to produce a good, sometimes has a choice of different kinds of technologies. There might be two different ways that they can produce the same amount of a good using varying amounts of capital and labor. For example, they might be able to produce a good by using 1 unit of capital and 5 units of labor, or there might be another way to do it where they could produce it with 2 units of capital and only 1 unit of labor. Now, the one that they decide depends on which one is cheapest. If they're both going to be making the same amount of output, they want to do it the cheapest way possible. And the cheapest one will depend on what the prices are. For example, if the price of labor is, say, $5 an hour, and the price of capital is, say, $50 an hour, the price of each technology will vary. The first, it will depend on the price of capital times the amount of capital they use, plus the price of labor times the amount of labor that they use. So the first technology, with 1 capital at $50, 50 times 1, plus 5, price of labor is 5 units of labor. 5 times 5 will come out to be $75. The second one, where the price of capital, or they use 2 units of capital, and the price of capital is $50, plus 1 unit of labor at a price of $5, will come out to be costing $105. So the one that they pick will be the cheaper one, which is $75.
Competition is also important to make sure that producers, the sort of self-interested, profit-driven types, don't hold up society for ransom. As much as producers would like to increase prices, the limits are set by the market. Business persons are surprised, in fact, when you ask them why they don't increase prices in order to make more money. From an economist's perspective, prices aren't high because of the benevolence and social consciousness of the firm, but only because the firm can't get away with it. Self-interest, whether we like it or not, is the common denominator that motivates individual economic agents, whether those be consumers or producers. Our final question involves the distribution of production, or who gets what. In a free market system, these amounts are determined in a non-centralized way. Income is the primary determinant of how much a household gets. Income is the flow of earnings. It comes from sources like wages, salaries, interest, and dividends. Now, wealth measures accumulated earnings, savings, or inheritance. Wages reflect individual choice to some extent. Your income partly reflects your willingness to forego leisure activity. You'll work for wages only if those wages are large enough to entice you from leisure pursuits. Wages also reflect investments in human capital. Your willingness to take classes is an investment that you expect will earn a higher wage. Again, markets are important determinants of wage rates. Just like in the product market, workers face competition, and if workers won't take jobs at market wages, they won't be able to find employment. Institutions also affect how much an individual earns, and wealth is often just a matter of luck. Later in the class, we'll talk in detail about market imperfections. The existence of wage discrimination is an example of an imperfection in the labor market that gives rise not only to injustice, but to inefficiency as well. Imperfections often motivate government intervention in the economy. Now, when we have a situation that's neither pure command nor pure laissez-faire, the economy is said to be mixed. Mixed economies are typical of realistic economic systems. It's best to view mixture along a continuum from more or less command to more or less laissez-faire. In answering the three fundamental questions, what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce, we've stressed the importance of markets. Consumers direct producers in terms of desires for goods and services. Producers choose efficient methods of production in the drive for profits. The consumption-production mix then determines the distribution of income in the economy, or who gets what. But we've not addressed important issues such as equity or justice. Is, for example, a market system fair or right? Cigarettes can be efficiently produced, but should they be produced at all? When making decisions about how to go about producing, is it ethical to allow persons to work in conditions that are dangerous to their health and safety? Is it right for employers to restrict access to jobs because of race, age, or gender? These sorts of questions about right and wrong are in the realm of normative economics. Although we stated that our perspective in this class would be objective in nature, it is difficult or impossible for economists to avoid thinking about these issues and addressing them. Years ago, it was imagined that there was a clear distinction between normative and positive economics, but that may not be the case. Since we can't avoid normative issues, we'll show you throughout the class differing opinions about economic theory and the sources of controversy. It seems that major controversies in economics stem from the problem of scarcity. We can't have everything we want, so we have to make hard choices. When we shop for food or clothing, we typically have a budget. And given our budget, we try to select items to purchase that are the best deal. When we operate under a budget constraint, we always have to choose. Now, although we may want to buy everything, we have to settle for less. You might think that if you had all the money you could imagine, the problem of scarcity would go away. But that's not true either, because there's never enough time. We can generalize our discussion of scarcity by using an economic model, a simple economic concept that helps clarify the issues of scarcity, choice, and decision-making is the production possibilities curve. It shows what can be produced given existing resources such as land, labor, capital, and available technology. The model demonstrates that although resources are fixed in supply, the number of choices of how to use those resources to produce goods and services is large. Well, let's take a look at the model for two goods that an economy could produce. Remember that we take as given existing resources and technology. On the vertical axis, we'll plot the quantity of food that a hypothetical economy could produce in a year. In this case, the axis ranges from 0 to 20 million tons. On the horizontal axis, let's plot the quantity of clothing that could be produced in a year. That's from 0 to 5 billion yards of cloth. On the graph, let's indicate how many tons of food could be produced if all resources were devoted to food production. We indicate that by marking point A at 20 tons of food and 0 yards of cloth. At the other extreme, we indicate how many yards of cloth can be produced if all resources are used in the clothing industry. That's marked point B. Points A and B are possibilities, but they aren't likely outcomes. More reasonably, some resources would be used for food production and some for clothing production. Let's begin at point A. Recall that here all resources are used to produce food. In order to produce clothing, we have to redirect production away from food. That means we have to give up some food in order to obtain some clothing. In other words, we trade food for clothing. Realistically, some resources are better suited to clothing production than they are to food production. That means we can give up a little bit of food to obtain relatively more clothing. This is indicated by point C. We can generate the complete production possibilities curve in a similar way, giving up food for clothing and tracing the maximum bundles we could produce. Notice that as we move in the direction of more clothing, the curve becomes steeper. That's because we must begin to use resources to produce clothing that may be suited better to food production. The area inside the curve represents feasible combinations of food and clothing. But since the economy isn't producing at the boundary, resources or technologies are not being fully utilized, so production is not efficient. The area outside the curve are not feasible combinations given current resources and technology. The opportunity cost of a product is the alternative that is given up in order to obtain the product. So in this diagram, we measure the opportunity cost of food in terms of clothing, and vice versa. The cost of clothing is measured in terms of food. What we have to give up relates to the slope of the production possibilities curve. It's called the marginal rate of transformation. It's been recognized for a long time that the opportunity cost of a product increases as more of the good is produced. The law of increasing opportunity costs then means that the production possibilities curve is bowed out from the origin. In other words, the marginal rate of transformation becomes larger in absolute value as we increase production. This feature reflects the specialized characteristics of resources that are used in production. If an economy decides to produce wheat, for example, it will be wise to plant seeds where they will have the highest yield. In other words, to use the most productive land first. As more and more wheat is planted, less productive land is used, so the opportunity cost of wheat increases. Although economic production is constrained to fall within the production possibilities frontier, that doesn't mean that the frontier has to remain fixed. Economic growth is defined as an increase in the productive capacity of an economy. It occurs when new resources become available or when technological change or innovation improves the way existing resources are used in production. Growth allows the production possibilities curve to shift outward from the origin. Well, let's consider what happens in our simple two-good model when a new fertilizer is discovered. It allows more cotton and more wheat to be produced, so the curve shifts out. Now, some innovations might only allow for the increase in production of one commodity. Imagine new genetic engineering for disease-resistant wheat. In this case, the curve might shift like this. Notice that innovation in the economy, even when specialized, allows for increased production of both food and clothing over a wide range. Although the production possibilities curve is a simple abstraction, it can help us understand quite complicated phenomena. One of the most important sources of economic growth is due to an increase in capital. Capital accumulation comes about by means of investment. Capital are products that are used to produce other goods and services. Let's develop a model and indicate capital goods such as machinery and equipment on the vertical axis and consumption goods such as food and clothing
on the horizontal axis. Now we'll split the screen into two and draw a production possibilities curve for a smaller economy on the left and for a larger economy on the right. For very poor countries, it might be difficult or impossible to set aside output, so resources must be devoted to consumption. This is indicated by point A on the diagram on the left. In the larger economy, investment and consumption may be more balanced, and that's indicated by point B. Over time, because of capital accumulation, the larger economy grows at a faster pace than the small economy and realizes a large shift in its production possibilities. This doesn't happen for the small economy, and we observe an increasing gap in economic opportunity over time. Now, if a small economy can redirect production towards investment, it can accelerate its pace of economic development and growth. Although the production possibilities curve is a very simple economic model, it illustrates important concepts and principles. It's helped us understand the problems of scarcity, unemployment, inefficiency, opportunity cost, and economic growth. Our next model is just a bit more complicated, but it is one of the most useful economic tools. It's the model of supply and demand.